Could you define for us, in your own words, in the context of your theoretical background, how would you describe what imperialism is? Like I said before, and with a lot of this audience probably being indoctrinated by a lot of these leftist voices in BreadTube, there's a lot of confusion about what that even means. So if we could just all get on the same page with that, I feel like, Caleb, you wrote this book, you'd probably do an excellent job explaining that for people.
Sure. Imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is not a verb. Imperialism is a system. Imperialism is an economic order. It is monopoly capitalism, where a small group of big corporations and banks in Western countries dominate the global economy. And they stay at the top of the world, and they hold back economic development and keep the world poor so that they can stay rich. Imperialism is a system. It is a global order, and it emerged really in the 1880s and 1890s. Capitalism went from its industrial phase of factory owners being the dominant faction to in the 1880s and 1890s, you had banks, trusts, syndicates, huge multinational corporations dominating the globe and keeping countries in poverty. You want to talk about imperialism? Imperialism is when the British Empire went to India. These people had been weaving for thousands of years, but they burned down all the looms and forced them to import their cloth from Britain. You want to talk about more recent examples? The top oil exporting country in Africa is Nigeria. Nigeria is the top oil exporting country in Africa. However, the people of Nigeria are largely illiterate, about 62% literacy there. The life expectancy is very low. And the people there are poor. And why is that? Because the oil from Nigeria isn't in the hands of the Nigerian people. It's in the hands of Exxon, BP, Chevron, and Shell Oil. Another great example, Mexico. For Mexican folks have been farming for thousands of years. Go back to the Aztecs, they've been farming. But in the 90s, the USA created NAFTA and enabled American agribusiness to come in there and put all the Mexican farmers out of business. And now people that have been growing their own food for thousands of years import their food from American agribusiness corporations like Kraft, right? And it's about holding back economic development, keeping countries underdeveloped, captive markets, client states who have to purchase their products from Western monopolies. In times past, countries exported products, right? They would sell products. But imperialism is the export of capital. It's where the world becomes dominated by a small clique of corporations and banks based in Western countries. And one of the big problems with the BreadTube narrative is that they talk about capitalism as if it's all just a matter of little tiny pencil factory owner and little tiny pencil factory employee, and it's not equal between them. And it's like, that's not capitalism in our time. Capitalism is the rule of the world by these huge multinational corporations. And war is used to enforce imperialism, right? If a country breaks out of imperialism, it becomes a target for attack. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia and China, they were good friends of the United States because they were both dirt poor countries. But when they broke free, when they industrialized, Russia is now a huge exporter of oil and natural gas in competition with American big oil giants. China makes half the steel in the world, a big competitor with American steel manufacturers. China has the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. Every ounce of steel that China sells, every cell phone that Huawei sells is something they didn't buy from American companies and American monopolies. And when countries break out of imperialism, that's when they become a target. And you'll notice that that's, especially when it comes to oil, who does the United States not like? Venezuela, selling oil on the international markets in competition. Iran, selling oil on the international markets in competition. Russia, right? What countries have we attacked recently? Libya, which used to be the top oil exporter in the African continent until it was bombed and destroyed, right? Iraq, which had, a major oil exporting country, a competitor, boss socialism. This is how imperialism works. It's about dominating the markets.
No, it's actually Caleb, dressing up as stormtroopers from Star Wars and having an emperor who walks around in a cloak all day and says to do bad things.
Well, and then, of course, it's very anti-Semitic for you to suggest that Western monopolies exist and have a primary influence in the way that the global economy works.
Yeah.
Or that's what BreadTube would say.
Yeah, it's very bizarre, right? We know, it's very easy to identify excuse me, the old anti-Semitic trope about Jewish bankers and all of that.
Right.
That's an old, that's an old trope that people have heard for a million years. But if you just talk about the global order, look, if you're going to say that describing Lenin's theory of imperialism is anti-Semitic, you're not just declaring that all communists are anti-Semitic. Noam Chomsky would be anti-Semitic.
Exactly.
Arundhati Roy would be anti-Semitic. Naomi Klein, whose great book, The Shock Doctrine, she would be anti-Semitic. This is what leftists have been talking about for years. Imperialism, the rule of the world by big banks and corporations based in the West.
So obviously that's a way that BreadTube serves imperialism, and I'll ask a little bit more about that later.
Probably one of the best examples of where BreadTube just totally misrepresents theory is when they began to start claiming that Marx was anti-statism by using, like, they quoted him, but they removed all the context from it by saying
Skippy the Bear.
Yeah, Skippy the Bear, I think, was the originator. The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Now, what they did was not talk about any of the context. They said, all right, well, this means he didn't like the state, guys. So the idea was that Marx didn't even condone this stuff. And therefore, if you follow Marx, you wouldn't be doing this. If you listened to Marx, you would never be doing this.
Yeah, and with, that would just necessitate that, like, all MLs and all communists believe that, like, the bourgeois state machinery is good? Is that what
exactly.
they anticipate?
Exactly.
Well, it comes from the Civil War in France, which is Karl Marx's lecture about the Paris Commune.
Mm-hmm.
In 1871, there was an uprising in Paris. The French government surrendered to the Prussian invaders, but the workers of Paris didn't want to live under the occupation of the Prussians. So they formed their own government, and they created the Paris Commune. And Marx saw it, and he said, this is the first historical example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right now, we live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Not, dictatorship, you think of one guy at a podium, screaming and wearing a military uniform or something. But dictatorship means rule. Like, if I dictate something to you and you write it down, I'm giving you instructions, or I'm dictating, right? And right now, it's those who own the means of production, the capitalists, who dictate, right? And the state is very much in their service. Well, the idea is that there would be a working class government, a dictatorship of the proletariat. And Marx saw this temporary government that lasted 2 months in Paris as the first historical example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that particular quote is him saying they couldn't just use the capitalist government to do it. They had to create their own government structures. They had to create their own police. They had to create their own parliament. And he spends the next several pages, which I quote in there, paragraph after paragraph, describing in detail the new state that the Paris Communards created. So for them to say that quote means you shouldn't have a proletarian state is ridiculous. It means that what was learned from that is that you can't just use the capitalist government, right? That you have to create new institutions. In Venezuela, Chavez got elected, but they were forced to ratify a new constitution and change the way the military worked, and change the way the police worked, and change the way the intelligence apparatus worked, right? That in order to have socialism, you can't use these institutions from capitalism. You need new institutions to serve popular power, right? And that the state, as Lenin put it, is simply the body of armed men, right? It's really the brute force that backs up state power, and that the state apparatus the capitalists have created is not going to work to build socialism. You're going to have to change the state. And that it was mainly social democrats who were arguing, no, you don't. We can just get in there and pass a few laws and everything will be fine. And Marx is saying, no, you have to have a whole new government. That's what he's saying. And the idea that and yes, the goal is to get to a world with so much abundance, so much prosperity, that the state can fade away, right? And we can kind of have a world where people just do what they want and do what they feel like doing and take what they need, from each according to their own ability to each according to their need. That's the ultimate goal. But that's the higher stage of communism. And that's only achievable when you have raised living standards so high that there is no inequality. Because at the end of the day, and this is a really important point, because Jordan Peterson and all these right-wing folks are on there talking about hierarchy, right? Jordan Peterson is on there talking about his lobsters and, hierarchy is just natural. No, hierarchy,
lobster.
Yeah. Hierarchy is yes, it's in our DNA, but hierarchy is a response to conditions, right? It's in our DNA to run, but you don't run all day long. You run when you need to. And
speak for yourself.
Yeah. But hierarchies are created out of social necessity, right? When you have a state of scarcity, When people are desperately struggling to survive, they will form hierarchies as a mechanism of regulating society. But as you raise the level of abundance and as there's more prosperity, hierarchies begin to fade. Nobody in the world was talking about, the rights of man and freedom of speech and freedom of religion until like the 1400s in Europe. And is that because people were just evil until then? No, it was because no one had achieved the level of material abundance and necessity to give birth to the level of freedom that we have now. And that communism, will give birth to an even higher level of freedom is the idea that once we can get beyond capitalism and raise productive forces, and that hierarchy, the state, inequality, these things are rooted in scarcity, right? When we don't have enough, we are forced to regulate. And when we do have enough, these inequalities and hierarchies fade away. That's very important. And it's the only real response to the alt-right. It's the only real response to those who claim that the hierarchy is just natural. So if you don't have this, you really can't push back against the alt-right, which is what it appears they're trying to do. And they're doing a pretty bad job of it.
Absolutely. And kind of that natural essentialism of like certain hierarchies that develop, even though they're antagonistic towards the alt-right or that they say they are, these leftists or bread tubers who are condemning all of these socialist and communist projects feed into that natural essentialism of, oh, this isn't actually what socialism is. This is just how, the USSR, this is how China, this is how Venezuela are just, they're naturally predisposed to this hierarchy. In the final analysis, that's what they have to concede to.
Yeah.
Instead of that these are targets of the imperial core.